It was Christmas Eve 1945, a night that should have been filled with the warm glow of anticipation in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder family home, nestled on the outskirts of town, hummed with the joyful chaos of 9 children and their loving parents, George and Jenny. Marion, the eldest, a responsible and bright teenager, was helping her mother prepare for the festivities. Maurice, Martha, Louis, and Jenny Irene were all buzzing with excitement, their dreams already filled with the promise of Christmas morning. The youngest, 3-year-old Betty, was likely already tucked into bed, as were the 2 eldest boys, John and George Jr., both of whom had already gone to sleep. George Sodder, a successful business owner, and his wife Jenny had spent the day, like so many parents, trying to keep the secret of Santa alive, reveling in the fleeting magic of childhood. But this Christmas Eve would not end in joy. It would descend into a nightmare that would forever etch the Sodder name into the annals of unsolved mysteries. Around 12:30 a.m., Jenny Sodder was jolted awake, not by the gentle stirrings of excited children, but by the acrid smell of smoke. A fire. Panic seized her as she quickly realized the gravity of the situation. She roused George, and they immediately began to evacuate their children. George, ever the protector, rushed to get his family out of the burning house. Marion, John, and George Jr. made it out, along with their parents. But 5 children were still inside. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Irene, and Betty were nowhere to be seen in the chaos, trapped by the rapidly engulfing flames. Imagine being a parent, the screams of your children, the heat of the fire, the unbearable knowledge that some of them are still in that inferno. George Sodder, a man of strength and resourcefulness, tried everything. He ran to get his ladder, usually propped against the house, but it was gone, vanished. He then tried to start his 2 coal trucks, hoping to drive them closer to the house and climb on top to reach the 2nd-story windows where he believed his children were trapped. Neither truck would start. They cranked and sputtered, but the engines, usually so reliable, refused to turn over. It was as if every attempt to save his children was being thwarted by an unseen, malevolent force. The fire raged, transforming the Sodder home into a blazing pyre. Neighbors, alerted by the inferno, gathered, helpless, watching in horror as the house collapsed inward. The Fayetteville Volunteer Fire Department was called, but they were slow to respond. It was miles away, and by the time they arrived, the house was little more than smoldering ruins. The Sodder family, standing in the bitter cold of a West Virginia winter night, watched their home, and they feared their children, turn to ash. As dawn broke on Christmas Day, the air was heavy not with the scent of pine and presents, but with smoke and despair. George and Jenny, along with their 4 surviving children, were left with an unspeakable void. 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Irene, and Betty, were gone, presumed dead, consumed by the fire. But even as the community mourned, a chilling question began to emerge, a question that would haunt the Sodders for the rest of their lives and cast a long, dark shadow over Fayetteville. If the children had perished in the fire, where were their remains? The search for answers was just beginning, and it would lead to a mystery far more complex and terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Christmas morning, 1945, dawned not with joyous carols, but with the hollow silence of devastation. Where the Sodder family home once stood, there was now only a gaping, smoldering wound in the earth, a basement filled with charred timbers, twisted metal, and a fine gray ash that coated everything in a blanket of death. George and Jenny Sodder, their surviving children huddled close, stared at the ruins. Grief was a physical presence, a suffocating weight. But beneath the grief, a cold, sharp-edged question was beginning to form. The official investigation, if one could call it that, began with a grim assumption. Fire Chief F.J. Morris arrived on the scene, and after a cursory look at the devastation, offered his conclusion. The 5 missing children had undoubtedly perished. The fire, he claimed, had been so intensely hot that it had completely cremated their bodies, leaving nothing behind. It was a neat and tidy explanation, one that offered a swift, albeit brutal, sense of closure. The town mourned, the official reports were filed, and on December 30th, just 5 days after the fire, death certificates were issued for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder. Cause of death: fire or suffocation. For the authorities, the case was closed. But for George and Jenny, it was an explanation that felt profoundly wrong. Their parental instincts screamed that their children were not in those ashes. George, in a move that would later be heavily criticized, couldn't bear to look at the blackened pit that had been his home. Overcome with grief and a desperate need to create a place to honor his lost children, he brought in a bulldozer and filled the basement with 5 feet of dirt. He intended to plant a memorial garden, a beautiful testament to the lives that had vanished. This act, born of a father's broken heart, would forever contaminate the scene, burying any potential evidence that might have remained. Or perhaps, as George may have suspected even then, there was simply nothing left to find. Jenny Sodder, however, could not rest. The fire chief's words about complete cremation echoed in her mind, a discordant note in the symphony of her sorrow. She was a practical woman, and the idea of 5 bodies vanishing without a trace defied logic. So she began her own quiet, gruesome investigation. She started conducting experiments in her backyard. She would procure animal bones, chicken bones, beef joints, the remains of small game, and burn them in a hot fire, trying to replicate the conditions of that night. No matter how hot the fire, no matter how long she let it burn, the result was always the same. The bones would char, they would become brittle and black, but they never disappeared. They remained. Her conviction grew stronger with every failed experiment. She began to read, consulting with experts at crematoriums and pathologists. She learned that a human body, to be reduced to ash, must be subjected to temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours. A house fire, even a fierce one fueled by wood and coal, rarely reaches such temperatures consistently, and certainly wouldn't have burned long enough before the structure collapsed to completely obliterate 5 sets of skeletal remains. At the very least, fragments of bone, teeth, pieces of the skull, the densest parts of the spine, should have been left behind, easily identifiable among the debris. And then there were the other objects found in the ashes. The tin roof of the house lay where it had fallen. The metal frames of appliances, though warped and melted from the heat, were clearly visible. Coins from a purse were found fused together. The fire had been hot enough to melt metal and glass, yet it had supposedly vaporized bone, which is far more resilient. How could this be? Imagine being Jenny Sodder, a grieving mother forced to become a forensic investigator, conducting macabre tests in her garden, driven by the unshakable certainty that the official story was a lie. The absence of her children's remains was not proof of their death. To her, it was proof they were never there. The authorities had closed their books, but Jenny Sodder had just opened a case that would consume the rest of her life. The fire had destroyed their home, but what was missing from the ashes suggested a crime far more sinister than a simple tragic accident. With the official explanation of accidental death feeling more like a convenient fiction than the truth, George and Jenny Sodder began to sift through their memories, re-examining the weeks and months before the fire. They were searching for fragments, for anything that seemed out of place. And as they did, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The fire, they realized, was not a sudden, random tragedy. It was the explosive climax to a slow burn campaign of intimidation and threat. It began with a strange phone call. Around 12:30 a.m. on the night of the fire, just an hour before she would be woken by the smell of smoke, the phone in the Sodder home rang, jolting Jenny from her sleep. When she answered, an unfamiliar woman's voice was on the line, asking for a name she didn't know. Jenny politely told the caller she had the wrong number. But then, the woman let out a strange, mocking laugh before hanging up. Jenny remembered hearing the clinking of glasses and loud chatter in the background, as if the call was being made from a noisy bar or a party. At the time, She dismissed it as a simple mistake, a harmless wrong number. Now, she wondered if it was something more sinister. Was someone checking to see if the family was awake? Then, there was the sound. After hanging up the phone, Jenny, who had been asleep on the downstairs couch, had just drifted off again when she was startled by a loud, distinct thud on the roof of the house, followed by a rolling noise. It sounded as if someone had thrown something heavy up there. An hour later, the house was in flames, the fire starting in the attic, right where she'd heard the sound. The evidence of sabotage was undeniable and went far beyond a suspicious noise. The ladder George always kept propped against the side of the house, his one immediate hope of reaching his children on the second floor, was not simply missing. It was later discovered thrown down an embankment more than 75 feet away from the house. No gust of wind or simple accident could account for that. It was a deliberate act meant to thwart any rescue attempt. And his trucks, both of which had been working perfectly the day before, were suddenly useless. He and his older sons, frantic and desperate, tried to start them to no avail. A later inspection would suggest they had been tampered with, their wires intentionally cut. Every path to saving the children seemed to have been methodically blocked. These were not random acts of misfortune. They were calculated moves in a terrifying game, and the Sodders soon realized there had been warnings. Weeks before Christmas, a man had come to their home trying to sell them life insurance. When George politely declined, the man's demeanor turned ugly. He became enraged, sneering at George and issuing a chilling threat. "Your goddamn Mussolini-hating house is going up in smoke," the man spat, "and your children are going to be destroyed." The threat was disturbingly specific, referencing George's outspoken criticism of the Italian dictator, a source of frequent and heated arguments with some other members of the local Italian-American community. George, an immigrant from Sardinia, had never shied away from his political opinions, but he never imagined they could put his family in mortal danger. Another stranger had appeared at the home a short time before the fire, asking for hauling work. While at the back of the house, he pointed to the 2 fuse boxes. "This is going to cause a fire someday," he had said to George. At the time, George thought it was an odd but harmless comment. He had, after all, just had the house rewired and inspected by the local power company, who assured him it was perfectly safe. In retrospect, it sounded less like a warning and more like a promise. The family was being watched. The older Sodder children later recalled seeing a strange car parked along the main highway for several days, its occupant seemingly observing the younger children as they walked home from school. All these disparate, unsettling events, once dismissed as coincidences or minor oddities, now clicked into place like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. The fire wasn't an accident caused by faulty wiring, as the fire marshal had half-heartedly suggested. It was arson, and it wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to create chaos, to provide a cover, a perfect distraction for a brazen kidnapping. The real horror wasn't buried in the ashes of their home. It had been driven away in the dead of night, leaving a family to search for ghosts. For years, the Sodder family's search was a grueling, earthbound affair. They hired a private investigator, a man from Washington, D.C. named C.C. Tinsley, who unearthed disturbing local rumors and confirmed their suspicions of a cover-up, but found no trace of the children. George and Jenny erected a large, haunting billboard along Route 16, featuring pictures of their 5 missing children and offering a substantial reward, first $5,000, then $10,000, for any information that would lead to their recovery. The billboard became a local landmark, a permanent public wound that refused to heal. It stood as a silent accusation against the official story, its faded photographs staring out at the passing traffic, a constant reminder of the children who vanished. The years bled into one another, turning hope into a dull, persistent ache. The surviving Sodder children grew up, had families of their own, but the shadow of their lost siblings was a constant presence in their lives. Then, more than 2 decades after the fire, a single envelope arrived that ripped the old wounds wide open. It was 1968. The letter, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, was addressed directly to Jenny. Inside was a small photograph of a young man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. He had dark curly hair, dark eyes, and a strong, somewhat angular face. His expression was neutral, almost detached. On the back of the photograph, a cryptic and chilling message was scrawled in what appeared to be blue ballpoint pen. It read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Elil boys, A90132 or 35. For Jenny and George, the resemblance was immediate and electrifying. The high forehead, the shape of the nose, the curve of the eyebrows. It was their Louis, all grown up. Louis had been 9 years old on the night of the fire. The man in the picture was the right age. The mention of brother Frankie was another stunning detail. Frankie was not a name known to the public. It was the nickname of their son, John. And Elil boys could have been a hastily scrawled reference to their family. The numbers, A90132 or 35, remained a mystery. Were they a code? A prison number? A military serial number? The family's hope, which had been flickering for 23 years, roared back to life. This was it. This was the proof they had been waiting for, tangible evidence that at least one of their sons was alive. But the hope was laced with a potent poison. The letter contained no return address, no explanation, no way to respond. It was a message from a ghost, a breadcrumb dropped from a phantom world they couldn't reach. They immediately hired another private detective and sent him to Central City, Kentucky, to investigate. But the trail was cold before it even began. The detective scoured the town, showed the photograph around, but found no one who recognized the man. The sender, like the subject of the photo, had simply vanished. The photograph became the new centerpiece of their investigation. George and Jenny updated their billboard, adding an aged-up image of the man in the photo, a composite of what their Louis might look like now. They published it in newspapers and magazines, begging for the sender or the man himself to come forward. The letter tormented them. Was it a cruel, calculated hoax designed by a psychopath to prey on the grief of a desperate family? Or was it a genuine, fleeting message from a lost son, a man who for some reason could not or would not reveal more? The ambiguity was its own form of torture. Imagine being Jenny Sodder, holding that small photograph in your hands day after day. You stare into the eyes of a stranger who looks just like the son you lost. A man who might be living a whole other life somewhere. A man who remembers his brother Frankie. The photo was no, is an answer. It was a question, one that echoed in the hollow spaces of their hearts. A question that would follow them to their graves. The fire had taken their children. The letter and the photograph ensured they would never truly be gone, but would instead haunt the periphery of their lives forever. With the official explanation of the fire reduced to a scientifically implausible footnote, the Sodder case transforms from a story of loss into a chilling detective story. The central question is no longer if a crime was committed, but who possessed the motive and the means to orchestrate such a monstrous act. Over the decades, several theories have emerged from the shadows, each attempting to explain the impossible disappearance of 5 children. The most prominent and enduring theory is that the Sodder family fell victim to the Sicilian mafia. This was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted retaliation. George Sodder was, by all accounts, a successful, hard-working, and opinionated man. An immigrant from Sardinia, Italy, he was fiercely proud of his heritage, but equally vocal in his condemnation of Benito Mussolini and his fascist regime. In the coalfields of West Virginia, home to a large and politically divided Italian-American population, such opinions could make a man enemies. The insurance salesman's threat was not a random outburst. It was a direct link between George's anti-Mussolini sentiments and the fate of his family. Was it possible he had run afoul of pro-fascist elements connected to organized crime? The methods used on Christmas Eve aligned disturbingly well with the mafia's playbook. Extortion, or the pizzo, was common. A successful businessman like George, who owned his own trucking company, would have been a prime target. His refusal to pay, his defiance, would have been seen as an unforgivable insult, requiring a severe lesson. The fire served as the perfect public spectacle of their power, a warning to others. But killing the children would have been too simple. Abducting them was a far crueler, more permanent form of punishment. It was an attack on George's legacy, a promise that his family line would be destroyed, just as the insurance Huntsman had threatened. It would also explain the shocking ineptitude and apparent lack of interest from local law enforcement. In a town where the mafia's influence could instill widespread fear, witnesses would remain silent and officials could be bribed or intimidated into closing the case quickly. The wall of silence the Sodders faced was perhaps not one of indifference, but of terror. A related theory branches off from the kidnapping. The children were not taken for revenge, but for profit. In the mid-20th century, a dark underbelly of society thrived on black market adoptions. Corrupt doctors, lawyers, and even orphanage officials were involved in vast child trafficking rings, stealing children from poor or vulnerable families and selling them to wealthy, desperate couples. Could the Sodder children, healthy and from a good home, have been targeted for this purpose? The fire would have been the perfect cover, creating the legal fiction of their deaths and allowing them to be given new identities and new lives, forever cut off from their past. This theory offers a sliver of hope that they lived, but it is a hope wrapped in the horror of a stolen identity. The Louis Sodder photograph, in this context, could be seen as a message from a young man who had discovered the truth of his origins, a fleeting attempt to reach across the void before being silenced once more. Of course, the enemy may not have been a sprawling criminal organization. The perpetrator could have been a single individual nursing a deep and personal grudge. A business rival ruined by George's success, a disgruntled former employee, or someone entangled in a personal dispute we may never know about. The meticulous planning, the cut phone line, the disabled trucks, the stolen ladder, suggests a cold, calculated rage. It speaks to a villain who didn't just want the Sodders to suffer, but who relished the idea of their slow, unending torment, the psychological torture of never knowing. All these theories swirl around the central, unavoidable fact that the official story makes no sense. The fire that was supposedly hot enough to vaporize 5 human skeletons somehow left behind the tin roof, appliance parts, and even melted coins. The investigation was closed with suspicious haste. The site was bulldozed without a thorough search, and every strange clue was ignored. The truth, it seems, was not buried in the ashes. It was deliberately obscured, hidden behind a smokescreen of official incompetence and a wall of local silence. The Sodders were not just fighting a fire. They were fighting an invisible enemy, a conspiracy that stole their children and then methodically erased the trail. The shadows in Fayetteville are long, and they have held their secrets for a very long time. While the town of Fayetteville gradually absorbed the Sodder fire into its local folklore, and the authorities considered the file permanently closed, for George and Jenny Sodder, the investigation had only just begun. The tragedy did not break them. It forged them into something else entirely. They were no longer just a grieving father and mother. They were detectives, archivists, and crusaders, driven by a singular, obsessive purpose: to find their children. Their life was no longer measured in holidays and birthdays, but in clues, leads, and decades of crushing disappointment. The most visible testament to their relentless search was the billboard. Erected along Route 16, the main road through town, it was a stark and unavoidable monument to their loss and their hope. It featured the portraits of the 5 smiling children, their young faces a haunting contrast to the bold block letters offering a $10,000 reward for information. For over 40 years, that billboard stood as a public declaration of the Sodders' refusal to surrender. George meticulously maintained it, updating the paint, ensuring the images never faded too much. It was a landmark of grief, a silent scream that echoed across the Appalachian Hills, ensuring that no one who passed through Fayetteville could ever forget the children who vanished. Their search consumed everything. They poured their life savings into the effort, hiring a series of private investigators. The most notable, C.C. Tinsley, uncovered a shocking conflict of interest that confirmed their deepest fears of a cover-up. Tinsley discovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened George with his house going up in smoke was, inexplicably, a member of the coroner's jury that ruled the fire an accident. The fox, it seemed, had been guarding the hen house. Tinsley also heard whispers in town of the fire chief, F.J. Morris, finding a human heart in the ashes and secretly burying it in a metal box. Years later, when confronted, Morris would admit to the burial, leading the family to exhume the box. Inside, they found not a human heart, but fresh beef liver, untouched by any fire. It was a bizarre and cruel deception, one that seemed designed to placate the family with false evidence of death. For every piece of deception they uncovered, there was a fleeting glimmer of hope from afar. They received letters and calls from all over the country. A woman who ran a hotel in Charleston claimed to have seen the children in the company of 2 men and 2 women a week after the fire. A waitress in a St. Louis diner swore she had served a young woman resembling Martha Sodder. A letter arrived from a woman in Florida, claiming that Louis Sodder had revealed his identity to her while intoxicated. George and Jenny pursued every lead, no matter how flimsy. They traveled across the country, showing their children's photos in dusty towns and bustling cities, always returning home with nothing but more questions and heavier hearts. Imagine dedicating every waking moment, every dollar, every ounce of your emotional energy to a single unanswerable question. This was the life of George and Jenny Sodder. Jenny became a figure of local legend, a woman perpetually in mourning. She wore black every day for the rest of her life, not for the dead, but for the lost. She tended to the beautiful memorial garden they had planted in the footprint of their old home, a living tribute on top of what she believed was an empty grave. She never allowed the family to lose hope, but the search walled her off from the world, her life a constant, painful vigil. In 1969, a year after receiving the confounding photograph of the man who could be his son Louis, George Sodder died. He had spent the last 24 years of his life searching, and he went to his grave without an answer. The quest fell to Jenny and her surviving children. The billboard stayed up. The search continued. Jenny passed away in 1989. After her death, after 44 years of waiting, the family finally, reluctantly, took the billboard down. The wood was rotten, the paint was faded, and the faces of the children had become ghosts weathered by sun and snow. The parents' endless search was over, but the silence they left behind was filled with the deafening roar of the unknown. George and Jenny Sodder are long gone. The iconic billboard that stood sentinel on Route 16 for 4 decades has been taken down. The surviving children who escaped the fire have lived their lives, carrying the invisible weight of their lost siblings, and some have since passed away, taking their memories with them. By all measures, the Sodder case should have faded into history, a tragic but forgotten piece of Appalachian folklore. And yet, it has not. In fact, the mystery of the 5 vanished children is more alive today than ever before. In the digital age, the Sodder family's story found a new home and a new generation of investigators. It has become a cornerstone of online unsolved mystery forums, a subject of obsessive debate on websites like Reddit, and the focus of countless podcasts and video documentaries that have been viewed by millions around the world. Amateur sleuths pore over the scant evidence, digitally enhancing the photograph of the man who might be Louis, mapping out the events of that Christmas Eve, and proposing new theories. The case has been reborn, its chilling details passed from one curious mind to another, a ghost story that has broken free from the confines of West Virginia and now haunts the global consciousness. The quest for answers remains a part of the Sodder family identity, a solemn inheritance passed down to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Sylvia, the youngest of the surviving children, who was just 2 years old on the night of the fire, became the family's de facto historian, the keeper of the flame. For years, she patiently recounted the story to reporters and researchers, ensuring the details were never lost, her life defined by a tragedy she was too young to remember. The family remains divided on what happened, but they are united in the belief that the official story is a lie and that a grave injustice was done. And so, the questions linger, as persistent and unsettling as they were in 1945. What truly happened in the final chaotic moments as the Sodder home was consumed by flames? Who was the woman with the strange laugh on the telephone? Who had the foresight and malice to cut the truck engines and steal the ladder, deliberately sealing the children's fate? Was the fire chief, F.J. Morris, part of a cover-up? Or was he merely incompetent? And the most tormenting question of all, who sent the photograph of the young man from Kentucky? Was it a cruel hoax, or was it the one and only time a lost boy tried to reach home? The Sodder mystery endures because it touches upon our most elemental fears, the vulnerability of our children, the sanctity of our homes, and the terrifying possibility that evil can strike and then simply vanish into thin air, aided by silence and conspiracy. It is the ultimate American horror story, not one of supernatural ghosts, but of real-world monsters and the profound, unending agony of not knowing. There is no resolution, no final chapter where the truth is revealed and justice is served. There is only a void, an absence of 5 children, and the echo of their parents' decades-long search. The physical fire that destroyed the Sodder home burned out in a single terrible night, but the questions it ignited have smoldered for an eternity. The night ended in fire, but the true mystery burned on. 5 children vanished, and their story remains unsolved.